What is that game show that we used to watch?
Hollywood Squares.
Hollywood Squares, yeah. Only they stayed in one place.
That's true.
Okay, we are now streaming live, so I'm going to call the meeting to order. This is Senate Finance, January 13th. And I think we're still missing one committee member, but I'm going to start. The agenda today is to get an update from the Department of Education on the CRF money that they received. There were several bundles, what that status is, what they did with it. I believe there was 14 million returned, which I believe Joint Fiscal has not used, but I know I'm hearing positive things, which we'll know next week when we get the revenue update about the revenue status in the Ed Fund. But just kind of walking us through the whole November 1st letter that set people kind of into a tizzy, and then where we are now. But I think we'll start. And I know Secretary French needs to leave by 2, so we'll start with him. So Secretary, welcome, and the floor is yours. You have a lot of people with you, so I'll let you just kind of orchestrate.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. It's good to see you. It seems just like a couple months ago we were meeting, so it's...
Yes, it was.
So nice to see you all again. Yeah, and thank you for the introduction. It's been a lot of hard work. It's also been a fairly dynamic situation. You alluded to the sort of the 15 million, 14 million. Right when we were in the process of doing that, the new package was announced, which included an extension of the CRF for a whole nother year. So, but today I do only have 30 minutes, but I'm happy to answer questions. But I do. Thought it was important to bring our team in that's been dealing very directly on these programs in all kinds of details. So Bill Bates, our CFO, Brad James, I think who you've met Brad before, and Jill Briggs, who's been a wonderful addition to our team, who's been really wonderful managing a lot of the detail on this. So it's been a very challenging piece of work. Every time these programs come out, we have to stand up, new ways to allocate the funds and manage it and so forth. And I was pleasantly sort of surprised. I just assumed all states were moving forward so energetically, and I guess apparently they're not. Vermont has been very successful, I think, and part of it's our partnership with our legislators on being able to get these funds out the door rapidly as possible. So, thank you for your support. With that, I'll turn it over to our CFO, Bill Bates, who I think Bill's going to share his screen perhaps, and invite the others to take you through a presentation and answer your questions.
Thanks, Dan. Let me see if I can share my screen here.
Faith need to make you a co-host?
I think Faith did. Let me know if you can see my screen.
Yes. CARE summary. It is up.
Excellent. All right. Well, Madam Chair, thank you for having us. And if it would be all right, I'd like to just take a brief moment and introduce our newest team member. That is Jill Briggs Campbell. She came onto the scene about 10 months ago. And I think, Jill, it was your first week on the job that we said, surprise, surprise, surprise. We're going to repurpose your position for a temporary basis to help out in the agency COVID response. Jill has been with the team for about 10 months. We hired her as a business project manager and as the results-based accountability lead. But like I said, COVID hit about 10 months ago, just as she was coming on board, and she has done a remarkable job of helping us navigate the everything COVID. Jill, do you want to?
I was told this morning that it is 10 months ago today that the legislature got sent home. So I hope, Jill, you don't take that personally if you got hired and we went home on the same.
It was my first day, actually, was the day that everybody went home.
Oh, welcome to our strange new world.
Yeah, thank you. So I've been told I need to say Jill Briggs Campbell, Agency of Education, when I sign on here. As Bill said, it's been a wild ride. I've been on managing the federal emergency funds, as well as working with Ted Fisher on the COVID-19 response team. So that's included all of the school testing and all of those missions as well. So needless to say, it's been a crash course. In particular with the federal emergency funds and this next bucket of funding, which I'm sure we'll touch on today. If you need details on the status of any particular fund at any time, please feel free to reach out to me. I'll probably have my fingers in all of those pots as well. So I'm available for whatever information you need. And I'll hand it back to Bill with that. But thank you all for having me here today.
All right, thank you, Jill. So yes, Bill Bates, for the record, Agency of Education. And what we would like to do is give you a high-level overview of care summary, which would include ESSER gear, and we've got in here CRF summer food and child nutrition. We also have joining us today, Brad James. He's going to also provide a deeper dive into the CRF portion of it as far as CRF is concerned for LEA and independent schools. And so with that, we'll proceed to the next slide. So as you're familiar, we have received $28 million as of March 27th, and this is ESSER money that we're talking about here as part of the CARES Act. And that grant goes from March 13th of 2020 all the way out to September 30th. And that if you jump down on as of January 12th of 21, we have 11 LEAs that have approved grant awards totaling $6.7 million. And you might wonder, all right, well, we were awarded $28 million. We've only awarded $6.7 million. Why is that? You'll recall that with CRF, it had a very short window of use. And originally it was going to expire on December 30th of 2020. And then we just got an extension for 12 months. But the LEAs, and I think rightfully so, have been focused most of their attention on utilizing the CRF funds initially. And now that we've done that, you're likely going to see a more rapid application process with the ESSER funds for LEA. They have until March 20th of 21 to submit their applications. And Jill, I think just earlier this morning, you had an LEA calling you and walking you through, asked you to walk them through the application process for ESSER. Is that right?
Yes, that is correct. And we're definitely starting to see sort of all the team members are starting to get more inquiries about ESSER. So they're turning their attention to it.
What kind of things are the grants for?
That's a great question, and thank you for the segue. Let's jump right over to the next slide. I think it'll highlight for everyone where we see the funds being used based on the approved applications that we've received to date. And you can see from this chart here that the bulk of the money is going to salary and benefits for teachers on remote instruction. Then you've got a significant amount being applied to supplies and equipment, meeting healthcare guidelines, additional staffing, and then also the cost for school operations. And Jill, we aligned these to the US Ed object codes, is that right?
Yeah, it was a little bit tricky to put these in these kinds of buckets. Our schools track them by accounting object code. So I will say these are a little bit arbitrary in terms of how I broke them out, but these are sort of the major cost categories that we're seeing. And the additional staff is going to include, just to break that out a little bit more, because I think we'll see actually a lot of costs going into there. The hiring of full-time substitutes in case of losing staff because they had to quarantine or positive cases, whatever it may be. The hiring of additional COVID nurses or coordinators, and the hiring of additional paraprofessionals. So that is one of the buckets of funding, in addition to salaries and benefits for teachers for remote instruction. Those are kind of the major, if we added those two together, I would say, as Bill mentioned, that would be the bulk of spending. Yeah. So going forward, I can carry these categories over. As I said, it's a little clunky, but we can work within those.
And now the next slide. Sorry, go ahead.
Madam Chair, do you want to wait for questions till the end?
No, we can take questions. I just can't see you.
Okay.
So I'm going to need a yellow hand, I think, or just say, Madam Chair.
Okay. Madam Chair, so I have a question on salaries, benefits for teachers for remote instruction. I'm just not sure. Can you explain that one a little bit? I'm figuring these are teachers who already have salaries and benefits when they were in person. What's this addressing when they went remote?
Jill, do you want to articulate the detail that make up the salary and benefits for remote instruction?
Yes, and as I said, this is not a perfect way to do this. I had to sort of do some coding to move those costs over. So what was included in here was the hiring of additional staff to teach remote. So it would not be, as you said, already budgeted instructors. It also included things like the professional development and planning time that went above and beyond budgeted expenses, training for online teaching, that sort of thing. I included in that bucket of spending. And then the supplies and equipment to support continuity of learning or remote education includes things like laptops, supply delivery, and those sorts of costs that are associated with that. I hope that helps to answer the question.
Yes, thank you very much.
Great.
Senator Brock, you had a question?
Thank you. I just have a question to make sure that I understood your last couple of slides related to some $28 million that were in March of 2020 made available to the state, and that we expended a little over $6 million. And we didn't know that until December that money would pass over into 2021. And so my question is, did I understand correctly that we would have left some $22 million on the table based on where we are at the early part of December?
Senator Brock, that's a great question. Thank you for raising that. If we go back to the slide just before this, what Senator Brock is highlighting for us in his question is that we have $28 million as of March 27th, and then we are taking credit for having awarded $6.7 million as of January 12th, 21. And so the delta there is the $22 million. The key point to highlight is the second bullet point here, Senator Brock and team. It's the grants went from March 13th, 2020 to September 30 of 22. What we were rushing to get granted out and obligated and expended was the CRF funds. And so that's different and separate and apart from the ESSER funds. It was the CRF funds had a very short window of use, and that was up until December 30th of last year, until the Congress and President passed the bill to extend their use for one more year. Does that help?
Well, yes. How much fell into each bucket?
How much fell into each bucket?
Well, in other words, you mentioned that the grant goes for that period of time. And here we're talking about the $28 million in total as part of the CARES Act. Was all of that $28 million, did it have to be applied before that December date, or was only a portion of that subject to that stricture? And if only a portion of it was subject to that stricture, what was the amount of each portion?
Yep, good question. So no, this is separate and apart from CRF. So CRF is the funds that came through the U.S. Treasury, and we have Brad James on the call today. Those, and he was leading that effort. Those funds were used.
Bill, can I jump in for a minute?
Yep.
Please. So Senator Brock, I think what you're asking, I think what you're doing is I think you are confusing the CRF money and the ESSER money. They're both from the CARES Act. You're quite correct about that. They have different uses and they have different time periods. The ESSER money that Jill and Bill have been talking about extended through September of 22. So that 28 million is good up through 22. I think what you're referencing and thinking about is the CRF money that Bill is alluding to. And that CRF money was a much larger piece of money. And it did expire up until the new legislation. It did expire on as of December 30th, 2020. But that's not the money that we're talking about right here in this slide. Okay, that's a different chunk of money. And that's the money that I'm going to talk about briefly in a little while.
Okay.
That money has been that money has now been extended out for another year. I think I want to say until December 30th, 2021 at this point.
Okay, so that money you're going to cover subsequently. It was a little unclear on which funds we were specifically talking about.
No, I understand your question entirely. It's unclear when you're in the middle of it too.
So this is the ESSER money only, and we've been told since the beginning that we would do the CRF because of the timing first, and then we would get into the ESSER. And it sounds like you are just now starting to take in applications for ESSER funds.
That is correct.
The applications have been open, but we have been suggesting to business managers, and the business managers themselves are pretty savvy about this, that it's best to use the CRF money first. So they didn't even, a lot of them didn't apply for the ESSER money as they were using the CRF money. And so this is kind of, they are starting to pick this up now.
And so as we see on the next slide, of the 11 LEAs that have approved grants, this is the breakup of that money that Jill spoke about. The next slide is just a different view, a different slice of that. It's showing you the numerical values of each of those categories. And unless there's a question, I'll move on. The next section is GEAR, which is another source of funds. This is the governor's emergency recovery funding. And so again, similar to ESSER, GEAR, we had 4.3 million that we received on March 27th of 2020 as part of the CARES Act. And those grants run from July 1st of 2020 through September 30 of 22. And as of January 12th of 21, we had 12 CTE, all 17 CTE centers had approved grants. And they have until March 20th to submit any amendments to the AOE. And on the next slide, we have a graph that shows how those funds are breaking down, which is similar to what we're seeing in ESSER. You can see here that for GEAR funds, we had supplies and equipment, and then additional staff, and then costs for school operations for in-person. And Jill, any commentary on the breakout of this and what makes up the individual bars?
No, I kept to the same categories with the exception of obviously food service not being one that applied here. So just as a point to reiterate here, for the GEAR funds, which have the same period of performance as the ESSER funds going through September of 2022, These funds, all of the grants have been awarded at this point. And so all of the funds have been budgeted for the most part. So this is funding that the CTE centers were definitely eager to jump on and didn't have any of the kind of same obstacles in terms of CRF or the debate over equitable services, which also extended the ESSER applications as we were waiting for the federal government and some challenges in the court. And so you can see that they've really spent quite, or are looking to budget quite a lot on modernizing some of their systems so that they can provide hybrid and remote instruction for a lot of the things that would normally be hands-on. And then also the second big bucket over to the right is the cost for school operations in person. They've had to make a lot of adjustments to the actual sort of physical plant and the way that classrooms are set up so that they're not sharing equipment and they can meet the safety and health guidelines. So that's why we're seeing the costs are looking a little bit different for GEAR than they are for ESSER.
Funds under supplies and equipment. I heard from a couple teachers who had kids who were doing school at home, a spouse that was working from home, and a teacher that was needing to do remote from home and ended up in a parking lot trying to teach her students from her car. Did any of that money go to help with internet hookups, line extensions, anything like that?
So in the review of, and are we asking about ESSER or GEAR or both?
Any of them.
Any of them, yeah. So both the making wireless devices available or increasing access to internet are both allowable costs for ESSER and GEAR. I did see, and this fell into that bucket of supplies and equipment, you're absolutely right. I did see that there was the provision of devices to increase Wi-Fi connectivity and other sorts of costs like that. I think that that sort of, those stories, the sort of anecdotal stories about classes being taught in parking lots, that was very much what we were seeing in the early days of school closure. I would definitely, haven't heard, you know, and maybe the secretary can speak to this, but at this point I would be surprised to be hearing that. But that was definitely an allowable cost, and we did see some of that in ESSER.
Yeah, I think that would be my recollection as well. I mean, it's anecdotal. We heard a lot more of that in the initial closure period. After the reopening, there's been a lot less of that concern. Not to say it's not out there, but I haven't heard as much about it from the superintendents or other stakeholders.
Thanks for that, Dan.
Go ahead, Bill.
Secretary, I'm sensitive to your time. You have a hard stop at 2 o'clock. Are there other comments that you would like to share before you have to break away?
No, I think just to refresh everyone's memory, I think, you know, Senator Brock's questioning, you know, just points to, you know, we've become fluent in these programs, but they are discrete and separate, and it's useful, I think, just to provide everyone with the foundational information. You know, what is ESSER, what is GEAR, what is CRF, and now to be somewhat complicated by ESSER 2 and GEAR 2. So we're, you know, it's a dynamic situation, but we sometimes take for granted that we have some fluency in this, but I think you'll find it useful just to get a refresher on these.
Definitely helpful. Okay.
Sure.
And we would be happy to do that. And we could work with Faith to get something set up, if that would be useful.
And I can, I actually have a slide that breaks all of that out a little bit more discreetly that I was trying to share it in the chat several times, but it was not working. But that's something that I can send over to the committee, if that's helpful.
If you email any of that background to Faith,
Yeah.
she can make sure we get it. I think a basic definition, I know ESSER and I know CRF. GEAR was new to me.
Okay.
So what does GEAR stand for?
The Governor's Emergency Education Response Fund.
Okay, I knew there was
Rolls
a
off the
govern, okay, I knew there was a governor's fund. I just hadn't tied an acronym GEAR to it. All right.
Was that at the discretion of the governor's office or what?
Yes, I mean, those funds, essentially CRF was the big bucket under CARES, right? And then discrete funding through ESSER was targeted to LEAs. LEAs are school districts, so part of ESSER was to make sure that districts got money directly. But then they gave each governor a pot of money, and its GEAR is basically designed to be additional education support, but it gave governors some flexibility to look at areas that might not have been addressed through CRF or ESSER. And Governor Scott focused in pretty quickly on CTE because the CTE centers weren't really addressed either through ESSER or CRF. And they were also, particularly around reopening, had a lot of reopening costs and so forth. So we thought GEAR was the best use there.
My question was that simply money given to the governor to use as the governor saw fit?
More or less within
Okay,
parameters.
Thank you.
Yeah, the parameters are, I would say, comparable. You know, I think of CRF as being very restrictive, ESSER being less restrictive. GEAR is sort of in that same category. It just gave it to the governors to allocate, but they have to be used in accordance with COVID-related education needs. There's a discrete list of available uses.
Madam Chair?
Yes, I think that's Senator Sirotkin. You have a question.
Yes, so there's a lot of reference being made to the CRF funds as being the big bucket. How much was allocated for education within the CRF funds? And were they part of the 1.25 billion or are they a standalone?
Brad, do you want to answer that?
I get off mute. They were part of the CRF fund, Senator Sirotkin. They are the CARES Act. So they're part of that $1.25 billion we got. That was the money, the CRF funds were the money that you all directed towards the end of the session. You started out at I can't remember what that first budget number was, the one you did that short budget for FY21. You directed us to have X amount of dollars that went to various things. Then when you came back in the session in the fall, the rest. I believe the total amount was around $103 million, which was broken out. I might be off by a little bit, but that was broken out between Efficiency Vermont, child nutrition programs, summer's food, and then money to the LEAs plus independent schools. So, but it all came out of the CARES Act. It was all part of that $1.25 billion.
Madam Chair, can I ask a quick question? Sorry,
Well, I
Senator
think
Sirotkin.
let Senator Sirotkin finish.
I'm sorry,
and then
I didn't
we'll go
realize
to
he
Senator
wasn't
Brown.
done.
I'm sorry.
Sorry
so
about that.
a couple of
Maybe
follow-
we could take the slides down if we're really into discussion and then we can see each other. Can we do that? There we are. Okay.
So just as a follow-up, is the 103 million, was that discretionary with the legislature? Could we have put more money into education and less money into economic recovery, for instance?
Madam Chair, I would almost defer that question to you as a member of the Joint Fiscal Committee, but I think that was more discretionary in terms of how much was coming to the
Yes, I
school
think
districts.
after we got through the emergency funding last year, that the bulk of this went through the appropriations process. You remember this committee did all the work on broadband and recommended amount. I believe probably the education committee did work on education. I see Senator Hardy, nodding, and recommended it. But the big expenditures, the block grants, if you will, of CRF went through the appropriations process.
Okay. And
Senator Hardy, can you add to that?
Yeah, just for clarification, Brad, the first chunk of money was a $50 million appropriation that was given in our first round in June. And that was mostly focused on summer nutrition programs and a few other expenses for basically getting schools to September. And then in our second round, we added another 54 million. I believe the total was around 104 million, Brad. And we took a lot of testimony in the education committee to get to that number about what the estimates from local business managers were going to be. We worked with Secretary French and this whole team you see here, and came up with that number of $104 million. The House had put in, I think, 96 million, and we in the Senate upped it to 104 million. And it was we could have given them more, but that was the number that was based on the testimony we got from school districts, and the agency seemed to be the right number at the time.
One last question, Madam Chair. I don't know if it was Brad or the secretary, but someone said the CARES money was most restricted, the ESSER money was less so, and the GEAR money was even less so. What restrictions are you talking about?
Yeah, I was speaking to the federal requirements as to what are allowable expenditures. So I think, that's, I think, how I view them. In particular, the CRF, the legislature had to navigate some pretty tight restrictions in terms of how to allocate those funds to ensure the costs were directly associated with COVID. ESSER, to a certain extent, I view as less restrictive because it basically says we assume school districts are going to have costs related to the recovery. We are going to give this funding directly to school districts as long as they're using the funding in accordance with an established federal program, and it can be justified as a COVID expense. They have some discretion in terms of how they use the funds. GEAR basically said to governors, and if there's anything that's not being addressed through ESSER in education, as long as it's within these general 5 parameters, feel free to decide how you want to use the funding. So I think it's that in the timeline aspect, for me, that makes a useful dichotomy because CRF had more restrictions, but also a shorter timeline. So everyone put their energy on that, particularly Senator Hardy said about reopening costs. ESSER is sort of the longer term funds. And we've certainly encouraged districts to sort of look at CRF first. Now that we're anticipating moving into recovery, we know there's a whole bunch of work ahead of us in terms of the recovery phase of this emergency. And it was just prudent to wait.
What does recovery mean?
Starting to go back to normal. And particularly, I think in education, I would define recovery as beginning to mitigate the effects of the pandemic on student learning and their development.
What do you predict is the milestone of the beginning of recovery?
Well,
given that the pandemic is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and
I don't know if it's getting bigger and bigger.
It's to recover from.
Yeah, I think it's certainly it's a complex topic, but we see it as being the ability to get back to more in person, because the in person is really the way we're going to address not only the instructional needs of kids, but also the relationships and routines that have all been disrupted. So it's an intersection sort of projection of conditions improving, not conditions getting worse and worse, if you will, but particularly with the advent of vaccine, warmer weather coming, modeling we're.
Madam Chair, I get hung up on definitions, but all this money's been spent on recovery and recovery hasn't started yet. So how do we put that into context?
Okay, I don't think it's been spent on coping and keeping the educational system functioning.
The bulk of the money in CRF particularly is about reopening school and being able to operate school in the conditions of pandemic. When I use the phrase recovery, it's like emergency recovery. It's like after the emergency's over, how do we begin to address those needs of students? And we're going to have learning loss and things like that.
But the emergency's not over and we've spent it all. So what do we?
Okay, Senator, I think there's more money coming.
Oh, no, so what do we call that? Recovery money or?
Okay, Senator, I think you're getting argumentative, and I believe I had recognized, I think it was Senator Bray ahead of you. Maybe Senator
difficulty understanding what we're talking about with certain titles and vocabulary. Thank you.
All right.
I wanted to ask this question before we lost the secretary, because it's kind of a 60,000-foot question, and that is, we need to respond to the emergency we have, and so that's how we've been responding. No question about it. And I'm just wondering to what degree we're investing in things that will in some way not serve us well or won't be that useful once we get back to, real normal. I mean, if you need a fire engine, an extra fire engine, you got to get one to put out the fire, but you might end up with an extra fire engine. Or is most of our investments repurposable, and you can see them transitioning into, schools once we're back to normal?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, particularly with Senator McDonald's line of questioning, because so much of the initial investment was about buying the fire engines, putting up, buying masks, PPE, things that we're probably never going to use again, knock on wood. But as we start moving into recovery, I think very much so we have to be very strategic about having the system evolve in a way that can improve the system after the epidemic's over. In particular, I'm going to transition out of this meeting to go meet with my partners at Mental Health. So we're spending a lot of time partnering with them in anticipation of this recovery phase, so that the relationships we build doing the recovery work will continue after the recovery period's over. So for example, in my experience as a school leader, I've worked in the Northeast Kingdom for 15 years, worked in Southwestern Vermont for 9 years. I've noticed over the years there's a significant difference in terms of how mental health services are provisioned in each region of the state. So COVID certainly exposed those inequities of how service delivery is happening. One of the things we want to come out the other end of this as part of our response is a more integrated response to social service delivery with education. So I don't say full service school model, but also to ensure that all regions of the state are being served adequately.
Great. Well, thank you.
I think at some point we have gotten some distressing building condition report, I think shortly before we went home. And I know we put money out for HVAC, but that's also essential, making sure that the air is clean. And I think at some point in this discussion, like to get to, those are ongoing investments. And we have a fairly aged school building population. So maybe talking about those kinds of investments. So
if I could real quick.
Yep.
I think this is a great segue into Brad's update on CRF. So we can do a deeper dive into CRF, and we can talk about the LEA portion of that. We can talk about Efficiency Vermont and the $18 million that they've invested, as well as the other programs. So if that's acceptable to you.
That sounds fine.
Brad?
All right, so the CRF money, which we've kind of been talking about in the background here and in the foreground and all kinds of different places, is, as has been said, it was more restricted in its use. The federal folks, when they wrote that language, made it fairly tight that it could only be used for certain things. And then as time progressed and U.S. Treasury, who was running the program, started sending out guidance, it loosened up a little bit. So people use it for different pieces. The monies that you all appropriated for the CRF monies that you appropriated to be used, you initially gave $6.5 million to Efficiency Vermont for HVAC systems, and they were able to come up with another $7 million, I believe it was, that they could use in the districts, and they've used most of that. We're still waiting to hear where they are right now. At this point, I don't think we've heard yet. But they basically spent $13.5 million on HVAC systems and upgrades, bringing the school buildings, I should say, up to the CDC and ASHRAE recommendations for what is needed for ventilation there. My understanding from talking to business managers, there's still a pretty good sized demand out there for more HVAC projects. That, bringing things up to code. Some of it can be done by doing simple, equipment in terms of air purifiers and things like that, which a lot of them done. Others are more involved and need more work in their actual HVAC system itself. So that's a discussion.
My concern when the 14 million was coming back and saying, does that mean every school's got adequate air? Didn't think so.
I
Didn't think so. Okay.
And one of the things we've talked about with that $14-15 million that's coming back is seeing what exactly Efficiency Vermont still can do and what that cost would be, because I know that they didn't do some things because of supply chain issues. The federal folks came out with information on how you could deal with supply chain issues. Basically, they said that if you ordered it and then it didn't come through no fault of your own, that was okay and you could spend for it. But if you knew it was going to come beyond the December 30th cutoff date, then you could not order it. It was not an allowable expense. So that got in the way, not only with some of the HVAC stuff, but some of the other stuff with the school districts themselves. So one of our ideas is that with that $14-15 million that is going to come back, is to take some of that and allow Efficiency Vermont to finish up whatever projects they could that were due to supply chain disruptions, things like that. We still don't know what the size of that is. I don't believe they've gotten back to us in terms of that. They are supposed to any day now, but I don't think we've heard as of right now. But I agree with you. I think there is more out there. And having heard from the business managers, I would say there definitely is more demand out there for more HVAC system. Okay. The new ESSER money can be used for HVAC system, but we need to be careful of that because we in the agency don't have the expertise to monitor those projects and see how they're doing and sign off on it. That's not our area at all. That's why Efficiency Vermont stepped in with the CRF money. So back to the CRF money. There was more money that was also given to child nutrition for equipment. They too had some issues. They weren't sure. I'm not quite sure what happened, but they had roughly $4 million for equipment. Different refrigeration units, et cetera, things like that. And they had some issues where the supply chain issue rose its head too, but I'm not quite sure in what sense because I haven't talked to people about that. But the money's going to go back to them, so they're going to be able to use their money for what we initially thought they would be doing. In terms of the school districts, as was mentioned earlier, it was all very fun, not funny. It was very awful timing in terms of when the CRF money was going to expire on December 30th, 2020. And then when the new bill was signed, I think it was on December 27th or 28th, I've forgotten which, that allowed it to go for another year. In that period of time, because there was a cutoff date, we were working with the fifth floor finance and management, and they had wanted to know how much money is not going to be spent so that they could take that money from education that was not being used and reallocate it out to other areas of the state. And that's what that $15 million came from. We thought there was about $15 million we weren't going to use. Okay. And so that was going to be allocated out. There was lots of discussion in the background, which you're probably aware of. And since the language was signed, the bill was signed, then the money's going to come back to us is how it appears. So in that case, because I'd had business managers say, once we gave that money up, but now it's going to be extended. Well, it hasn't been extended yet, and we don't have the money. It's gone, but it's coming back, so we'll get it back out to them.
I believe Joint Fiscal Committee declined to spend it.
Yes, thank you. On behalf of the school districts, thank you. So that's kind of where that stands. That's what that $15 million is. It'll probably be a little bit more because it's looking like not all districts were able to spend all their CRF money before the grant expired on December 30th. The way we wrote the grants was the money expired on December 30th. Boom, the grant died on December 30th. If you did not spend your money before December 30th, then that money will get swept back in. So that $50 million will probably go up. By how much, I don't know, but it will probably go back up some. What else along those lines? So I think just going back in general to the CRF money, again, as I said, it was fairly restricted in its use. It could not, initially when it came out, and you guys as the legislature ran into this with the education fund, it said you could not use that money to replace lost revenues. And so that was a hard thing. But then again, as time progressed, U.S. Treasury came out with guidance that relaxed that a little bit, and they allowed for CRF money to be used for for lack of a better term, repurposed money that was in your budget that was used for a significantly different purpose. So one of the things they said that was significantly different, and I think we talked about this last spring and fall, was the amount of time that teachers were spending, that staff, not just teachers, but staff were planning on doing remote learning, on getting ready for remote learning, not remote learning itself, but planning for remote learning. That was a reimbursable cost, even though those costs were in your budget because you're paying salaries, but they were being used for a significantly different purpose according to U.S. Treasury. So some of that money is the money that was sent out to the districts. They now were if it was an FY20 or FY21, they now got that money replaced. They have money sitting there, and that's the money that we're talking about. That's in Act 154 and whatever the first act was, which I still can't remember the number. Where we're rolling that money forward so that we are sending less money out for the education fund this year in terms of education spending, because they already have this federal money there on hand, and that is going to fall.
But we'd hope you'd figure out how to do.
Yeah. Well, we're working on that.
Okay.
It's getting a little clearer. We don't have a good number. I'll give you the best number in just a second. Then Senator Hardy, I'll let you know. Just stop talking for a moment. The number that I just got from asking business managers right now, and this is not the final number, is nowhere near as robust as I had hoped it would be. It's about $8.7 million. Currently in the Ed Fund Outlook statement, you're carrying a number of $10.9 million. So we're down. And that's just the way the business managers chose to use the money. And I'll answer the question with that in a minute, but I'll let Senator Hardy go first. Oh, I'm sorry. Senator, you should share.
Question?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair and Brad. Brad, you and I talked last spring a number of times, I would say. And one of my concerns then was that this 104 million plus other funds be distributed equitably to school districts. And with the reimbursement model, a lot of it is dependent on the school districts having a sophisticated enough business management office to come in and get the reimbursements. And I'm wondering on the ground what you're seeing in terms of, are the school districts getting those reimbursements in a broadly equitable way, or is it really, really concentrated on the school districts that have a more sophisticated operation?
It's hard to say. I know all the business managers. I know how they work. And what I've noticed in this is that a lot of them did not spend a lot of their monies in FY20 because of the school closure, basically the last third of the year, roughly. And so a lot of them had that money, and they used that money for different purposes. They probably could have had it reimbursed by CRF, but they didn't claim it. Yeah, I spent hours and hours and hours and hours talking to business managers, asking them, trying to get them to claim this money to help the Ed Fund, and they were very nervous and very cautious about it because they weren't sure that are the feds going to come in and say that it's not an allowable cost. And I kept saying, well, if they do, it's our problem, not your problem, because of how the language are. The states send it back. We'll get it back somehow, but the states send it back, not the districts. But they were concerned that costs would be disallowed, and so they didn't want to put themselves in that position. So some of what we're seeing that doesn't make it appear equitable is how they chose to do things on an individual basis. Their first and strongest inclination was to make sure their school districts are whole and healthy, and then after that they started thinking about other things. In terms of the ability, or in terms of the savvy maybe of business managers as to who's going to account for it, it was all over the map. There were big districts that asked for a lot. There were big districts that didn't ask for a lot. There were districts that asked for very little. And why they did it the way they did, I don't know. Again, as I said, I spent lots of time talking with them in their monthly meetings and individually trying to get them to do it. I think in terms of equity, if you looked at it on any way you want to look to, and any way you want to look at it, I do want to parse it out on a per pupil basis, on a district basis, on an SU basis. No, it's not equitable. But do they think it was equitable? Most of them do. I did have a couple of them say, well, what did everybody else put in? If my number's so low, why, how did they put everything, how did they put everything else? And they just worked at it more is the large part.
Do you
But-
have a spreadsheet of the reimbursements, the CRF money, and how that was allocated to districts?
What I have right now is I have their budgets from their grants. They in order to get a grant, they had to send us a budget that showed us how they were going to use the money. Now they could switch around how they use the money within that budget as time progressed.
Uh-huh.
But I do have that, and I just got it updated this morning. I do have a spreadsheet that has all the different costs in it. By
Are you
function,
willing
by
to
option.
share that? Or
Sure, absolutely, they'll love it. But yes,
I would love to. You know how much I love spreadsheets.
I know you like that.
And
Senator,
just,
we will let you report to the committee on what you find in all those spreadsheets.
I would love to. I love spreadsheets. And I just wanted to also ask Bill if he can share his presentation, because what is up on our website is actually a different slide deck. So I don't know if it got sent over or if it just hasn't been posted yet, but there's a different slide deck up on our website for today from AOE.
Absolutely. We'll be sure to share.
Thank you.
Brad, we interrupted you.
Not really. I mean, you know me, Senator Cummings. I just wing it anyway, usually. No, I think I was just trying to think of what are the big things were out there. I mean, there are the uses that they made with the CRF money are similar to what they did. If I look at it by general area, roughly, I'd say roughly 30% went to direct instruction, so to in-classroom type things, and roughly 20% of it went to the maintenance of the buildings and grounds and such, because there was a lot of work done with that. That might cost some. That might be some of the rentals that people were doing and things like that. And then the next biggest pot of money was probably the instructional staff support service. And I'll send you all this information. I'm looking at a spreadsheet at the moment. And then if you look at it more by expenditure type, we have roughly almost 30% was in, well, if I take the salaries and benefits together, we have about 38% was of all the money that the CRF money that was budgeted was in salaries and benefits. And then the next biggest chunk of money was the largest chunk of money, pardon me, was just over 39%. And that was for supplies. So that'd be PPE, and the supplies, and then equipment was a little bit more. And so that would cover some of the laptops and the Chromebooks and such. And it would also cover some of the equipment that they were using for making hotspots and things like that, which goes back to your question, Senator Cummings, about getting people to be able to access the internet. So the money's kind of in pretty broad areas. They're not the same areas that Jill was showing you, but they're similar to them. I just kind of took it straight out of their budgets as to what they're doing. And again, these numbers will change. I don't think they'll change significantly, but that's kind of how it's looking right now at the moment. A lot of it was personnel, and a lot of it was for supplies. That's where the largest pieces went.
You had something to?
Yeah, and I can just add a little bit of detail. I think Senator Hardy, you would want to know this about the child nutrition equipment grant. And so that went, quite a lot of it went to, just the general supplies, but also large equipment like walk-in freezers and refrigerators, because schools are having to store quite a lot more meals than they usually would, since they're not serving them day to day. And then we also had 3, possibly 4, I need to double check my number, districts that purchased vans so that they can deliver food for students that are learning remotely. So those are sort of some of the big cost categories for the child nutrition equipment. And there was $4 million that was granted, and I think at last count, like over 380,000 of it was already in their budgets, and then we've given them the additional time to use up anything that's left over. So they did make good use of that, and they, as Brad said, they ran into the supply chain issues as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Jill. I had talked to the agency about that, and it sounds like you made a really good use of the equipment and supplies and child nutrition, which warms my heart. Thank you.
Other questions here on where the money went? Is there a list? I guess part of what health and welfare is talking about doing is having a emergency, a disaster plan. All the one we have right now is aimed towards a physical disaster. The tornado takes down the school. It doesn't usually take down every school in the state, which the pandemic did. And just, are we following how many schools have adequate HVAC systems? How many don't? We had some discussion the other day about if we've got money to put in the systems, could this be used for radon mitigation that we haven't done the testing for? Lead turned out to be fairly inexpensive to fix, but radon could be fairly inexpensive to very expensive, depending on the construction. And are we doing any thinking about, because we've got another pot of money coming in. We know a lot of that's going to have to go to probably remedial, just education, mental health. I'm now a second grader and I haven't learned to walk in a straight line and be quiet in the hall. And I'm going to need to learn that at some point. But Jill.
So we did just really, as Brad was speaking about Efficiency Vermont, get some information from them that just came in. So in terms of the additional HVAC need, I'm reading the email as we're looking at it here. They've identified that 40 to 50 schools in the state have no form of mechanical HVAC, which is the primary pathway for improving indoor air quality in schools. In addition, they, as Brad said, they do have projects that they had to limit the scope of due to the supply chain issues. So they have literally, breaking news, just provided us with sort of three sort of categories of need that still exist in the state. In terms of the physical plant, the one thing I would caution is that no matter what the pot of money is, there does need to be a justification that it's COVID related, right? So indoor air quality, very clear. Something like radon, I'm not sure that's something that we would need to go back to the feds and actually get confirmation, is that an allowable cost? And I'm wondering if it would be useful, since we've sort of hinted at this new bucket of funding that's coming in, and it speaks to one of Senator McDonald's concerns, if it would be helpful to discuss what's in the CRRSA bill, or the Carissa bill, as we're calling it, because we got to call it something.
The new bill.
The new bill. And Senator Hardy, this is the slide deck that you were provided with that you were referencing.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
Phil, would you like me to take point on that, or do you feel like jumping on that one?
If you can share it, that would be great.
Okay, I will do. Oh, I don't know if I can share it because I'm not Senator Cummings. I have to be like a co-presenter, right?
Have to be a co-host. So
yeah.
Does
Bill, if you
Faith
want to
have
share
the slide deck?
No, you are now co-host.
You are now co-host, so you can ask and you shall receive. So you can now share. All right.
Okay, let me see.
Senator Brock, you have a question before we? No? Okay, your hand is up.
Must be from previously.
I haven't seen it before. If I get my cursor near anybody, I get a white hand, but this was a yellow hand.
All right. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. All right, let me see if I can do this as slideshow. Teams I've got down. Zoom is a new animal for me, so. All right.
Chris.
So
Essa, and now we have Chrissa.
yes, Carissa. So I think it would be helpful again to sort of talk about the different buckets.
I have something that's popped up that
I
says
see
give
that as
subtitles
well.
a try.
I'm
There it
not going
goes.
to give subtitles a try.
Okay, not right now. All
No.
right.
So here is the overview of what exists in these programs, and you'll notice some familiar faces here. So what we have here, this was in the bill that was passed on December 27th and was part of a larger sort of omnibus spending bill. We have the ESSER 2, GEAR 2, a new program within GEAR that's called the Emergency Assistant for Non-Public Schools, and I'll speak about that. The extension of the Coronavirus Relief Fund, which is CRF, and then some additional money for child nutrition programs, which I can also kind of outline in the broad strokes of that one. So for ESSER 2, this is really, it's going to be a new grant, but it's really an extension of what we saw in ESSER 1. It's the same allocation formula, but about 4 times as much money. So ESSER 1 was 28 million, and our LEAs will receive $114 million. So a substantial increase at the same allocation. The SEA set aside, so what the agency is able to hold, is 12.6 million. And I'll talk about some of the key details of this in just a moment. So substantially more money than ESSER 1. And so, Senator McDonald, this gets a little bit to your concern that you expressed, which is, wait, we're not even through the pandemic and we've already spent all of this money. Here's the next big sort of tranche of money that's coming in. So the key points on this one is that while ESSER 1 goes through September of 2022, ESSER 2 goes an additional year, so September of 2023. And the other sort of headliner on this is that there is no equitable services requirement. So ESSER 1 had a requirement that non-public schools had to be able to have some allocation of services and goods through the LEA. This does not have that requirement, and I'll talk about where the support for non-public schools is going to come from in just a moment. There's also of note for this group, I would imagine, is that the maintenance of effort requirement has been changed, the language. And if we have questions about this, I'll let Brad speak to that because that is definitely in his wheelhouse. But the ESSER 1 had sort of a dollar to dollar that needed to be maintained. The language here is a proportional share of the state's support for elementary and secondary education relative to the state's overall spending must be maintained between 2017, 2018, 2019. So that is also a change that would be, I think, important to note here. Same allowable costs for ESSER, which are actually quite broad. It's basically a list of about 12 categories, and then anything that is an allowable use in any of our regular federal funding can be used for ESSER. So as the secretary was saying, the range of uses here is pretty large. And then there is a specific emphasis in the legislation on measuring and addressing learning loss, and the state has a requirement to report within 6 months on how we are using these funds to measure and address learning loss. So there is that specific language in there. Any questions on ESSER before I move to the next bucket? And I can't see if anyone's raising their hands. So.
Yeah, okay. I think I saw Senator Hardy's voice pop up.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. Jill, could you just explain a little bit more about the proportional share? I'm reading it and I'm trying to wrap my head around it a little bit more. Brad, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what it is, Senator Hardy, is right now with the current ESSER, forgetting this piece, the current ESSER says that we have to maintain the same or a higher level of spending for education than the average of 17, 18, and 19. So for FY20 and FY21, they have to be higher than the averages. That's not a problem. That we met that. What this is now saying, though, is that proportionally, in terms of the state's budget, we can't drop below whatever that average was for 17, 18, and 19. I don't think we will, but I haven't looked at any of those numbers yet. But it's looking at percentages instead of the state as a whole, as opposed to a dollar figure.
Okay. Got it. All right, thank you.
Okay. Any other questions on ESSER?
Back so I can see everybody. Okay.
Okay, I'll go back to sharing. And
Nathan Lavery, I know you've joined us. Unless you have some real time constraint, I'll recognize you once we finish this presentation, if that works.
Sure, that's fine. Thank you.
Okay.
Nathan, you may enjoy the show as well.
Thanks.
Okay, so the next, and can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. So the next bucket of funds here is the GEAR Fund, which again is the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund. There are two different programs within this. So the first one, the total that the state of Vermont is receiving is just over $6 million. The first one is what's being called GEAR 2, and it is basically the same program as the first GEAR in terms of what it can be used on, who the eligible entities are. We are in conversation with the governor's office right now to determine where these funds will be prioritized. So that has yet to be determined. The second is, and so that's about 1.9 million. The second funding stream here under GEAR is called the Emergency Assistance for Non-Public Schools, the EANS. And this is where what would have been equitable shares in ESSER is now being designated into a separate grant. And usually the LEAs would be tasked with doing the equitable shares consultations with the non-public schools, and then also administering the contracts and services that those schools receive, because they are not allowed to receive the actual money. That is basically being put onto the SEA and onto the Agency of Education. So that's how that has moved. So for non-public schools, we have a total of 4.28 million. 200,000 of that can be retained by the SEA for administering the program. Both of these GEAR funds have that same period of performance that goes September all the way through September of 2023 and goes back to March 13th of 2020. So they do have the potential to receive reimbursements for costs incurred if needed. So that is the GEAR fund. And again, some of the highlights here I've already spoken about. The GEAR non-public, the EANS, is an opt-in program, meaning that the state of Vermont has to decide to apply for it and then submit an application to the U.S. Department of Education. So that is a decision point that we are awaiting from the governor's office right now. Any questions on GEAR?
Anybody have any questions? I can't see you, so just speak up.
I can't either.
Okay, I'm not hearing any, so.
Okay. All right, we've already discussed this, that the Coronavirus Relief Fund is being extended through December of next year. And as Brad has already highlighted all the details around that. So, And then the last thing is the Child Nutrition Emergency Funds. This is through USDA as part of the Carissa Act. I would direct folks, if you need specific detail on this, to Rosie Kruger, our State Director of Child Nutrition, because she will be able to answer the details on this much better than I can. But essentially, there's an opportunity if particularly LEAs, but all school food authorities and our child and adult care food programs, the CACFP, if those sponsors have lost revenue because they are not doing as many in-person meals, a la carte, paid meals, they have the potential to be reimbursed for 55% of that revenue loss, and they're measuring between 2 specific dates. So the impact could be variable here. We're seeing that the CACFPs perhaps will not have the same decrease in revenue. They don't provide meals in the same way. But that our school food authorities will likely benefit from this. We're awaiting USDA guidance and further information on this, which they're required to provide by the end of the month. So there's not a lot of detail on this at this point, but more is forthcoming on that. And so that's my high-level overview of the next round of spending. So I can stop sharing at this point, and if folks have a question, let me know.
Committee.
I will try to stop sharing at this point. It won't let me stop sharing at this point. There we go. Okay.
Yeah.
Madam
Okay.
Chair,
Senator
Madam Chair.
McDonald.
I did. How did it come to pass that I don't understand what the governor's office on such and such, how that fits in with the rest of the funding for education? Do we have a governor's office fund for broadband or a governor's office fund for highway improvements? Or, I mean, where'd that come from?
Brad, I think, has an answer.
Senator McDonald, it's in the federal legislation. They specified it. They said in the original GEERS, they said they broke up the ESSER money and the GEERS money, and they said this piece is for the governor to use as he wants in terms of education. And
Not unique to Vermont, or that's for all?
That's for everything. It was in the federal act. So that was for all states.
Okay, so
Probably has very little to do with Vermont.
Okay.
Yeah.
Marketing boy, there you go.
Well, you make compromises at 2 a.m.
That's true.
Things can get a little strange.
You guys have all been there.
Yeah.
But we're about to go
Okay.
there again, and I'm grateful for this hearing to try and learn what not to do again.
That's right. We're all getting older, and it's harder to make decisions at 2 a.m. All right. Committee. I've got too many screens. I've lost my agenda. There we go. Any questions? Because we are scheduled for a break. Actually, we're a few minutes early for a break. But I've got Nathan Lavery wanted to make a few comments. That will get us up to the scheduled break, I think. And then I'm going to take, I'd say at this point, I'm going to give you a good half-hour break. So you can, as long as I think Chloe can come in at 3:30 and give everybody a chance to rest their eyeballs and stretch their backs. And then we'll come back and give me feedback. This is one long break. I know Senator Bray was going to try smaller 10-minute breaks. I think we're all trying to figure out what coping mechanisms work. Senator McDonald, your head is now on that calf's body. When you move around, strange things happen.
Now I have ears.
Now you have ears. Okay, Senator Hardy, you had something before we.
Yeah, I just wanted
Right.
to mention to Brad and others from AOE, this is really helpful to get an update on this. And I'm wondering if in the future, maybe Chloe's going to touch on this a little bit, the interactions between this federal money and our state money and the school district budgets, and how this is going to impact decisions we're going to have to make down the road about state funding for education, especially with that proportional requirement and whether, yeah, anyway, the sort of bigger picture interaction with state funds.
We're going to have, I don't know how much detail Chloe's going into today. I think it's just our annual overview of the Ed Fund as it sits. I know we're going to get some changes in the revenue forecast. So that, we also have the report coming in from the tax department for changes in how we raise property tax. So we will be having lots of discussion. But I want to make sure we can't do the revenue until it's set next week. But once it's set, then, the new revenue forecast, then we can start really working. Senator Bray. You're muted, Senator.
Thank you. I just wanted to, say thank you to AOE for walking us through a very organized presentation on a lot of moving parts with a lot of money in different buckets. So that's been really helpful. I'm just trying to make sure I have the big picture straight. Even though we're talking about, hundreds of millions of dollars, is it correct for me to think of it as not taking any pressure off our state education budget, because these are really all oriented to paying for extraordinary expenses as opposed to displacing expenses we would have paid through ordinary means?
I thought I'd heard the secretary had a small tweak on that one.
Yeah, I mean, it's part of the money is going to help the Ed Fund. The vast majority of it will not be. It will be for new and unusual and budgeted expenditures, as you're mentioning. But part of it, again, based on the guidance that came out from the federal folks, does allow for some of the money to be used for monies that were budgeted that were coming out of that would have come out of the education fund that can now stay in the education fund. So that will help the bottom line some. That was about $8.7 million is what is the number.
I thought I heard about 8 million.
Yeah, not as I said, not as robust as I had hoped.
That is kind of decimal dust when you get to the end.
Right. And since I haven't had to keep track of this until coming back to this committee, where are we on total spend for education? 1.7 billion. Is that about right these days?
Yeah, I might be closer. Yeah, I think about one. I think it might be closer to 1.8. We're not at 1.8 yet, but I think it's close to 1.8 to 1.7.
Okay, so as the chair says, decimal dust. So
Yes.
We're always grateful for money, but it's not a big dent in the 1.8 billion.
That's right, but it all helps whatever that gap is down at the bottom. It would have been nice had it been larger, but it doesn't appear to be.
It wouldn't be decimal dust in my budget, but right.
No, mine either.
No, yeah, I'd like just a part of that, a little dust of that little dust. Okay, Senator Sirotkin.
Can any of the money be used for like capital expenditures, as far as you can tell?
I don't think so, because the federal legislation was kind of, I guess, guidance, not legislation, was really talking about what could be used to address the emergency itself immediately. I mean, if you talk HVAC as being part of capital, then yes. If you talk about building a new building, building a new wing on a building, renovating, that's much more up in the air, and it was a lot more questionable.
Possible though, maybe.
I will say possible, but I think before we went anywhere with it, we being the agency went anywhere with it, we would certainly be checking in with people who have a higher opinion or higher the decision level makers than we are, and we'd probably be talking to federal people too.
When you do things like HVAC and energy efficiency, can that subsume other construction as well as necessary, like a new classroom or something like
I think it all depends on my guess is, my strong feeling is the federal folks are going to come out and audit all these costs in the states. How closely they do it, I don't know, but I'm sure they're going to come out and look. And I think we'd want to err more on the cost side, instead of them saying, we're thinking, well, this might be okay, let's do it. And them saying, nope, that's not okay, send that money back. So it's a good question, Senator. I don't know the answer. The finance and management has taken on a group called Guidehouse as a consulting firm where they get yeah. I thought you probably did. So
they always say no.
Unless you don't ask.
Creative. Okay, any other questions for Bill and Brad and Jill? If not,
Jill has her hand up.
Jill has her hand up. Hi. Yes.
Yeah. So just to add a little bit to what Brad said, the new ESSER 2 does, in addition to some language around indoor air quality, has some language around the like adjustments needed to like the physical plant of a classroom or school in order to meet health guidelines. So that's sort of the bottom line on I think your question, and why Brad is leaning towards caution, which I think is correct, is that any of these costs have to have a clear, for CRF it was COVID necessary, like that was a very clear kind of line in the sand. ESSER, there's a little bit more wiggle room, but it is, we've seen schools do things like they've added a vestibule to the front of the school so that they can do health screenings as students walk in, or they've added outdoor classroom space so that they can continue to teach music class or whatever it may be. So if it was additional spaces needed in order to meet the 6-foot health guidelines, then that is a justifiable COVID necessary expense. If it's deferred maintenance, then we may be getting ourselves in a little bit more hot water there. So
building a new wing on the school.
Yeah, that
would probably
that pool we've always wanted.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Any other questions for the Department of Ed team? Okay, I'm not seeing any. So Nathan, welcome. Why don't you tell us who you are, who you represent at this point?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nathan Lavery. I am the Director of Finance and Operations at the Burlington School District, and I'm currently the president of the Vermont Association of School Business Officials, which is the association for all your local business managers, where we get together on a monthly basis. We get to hear from the AOE team with guidance on what opportunities and obstacles there are to using federal funds, and we talk about all sorts of exciting stuff. But I can be pretty brief today. I was actually listening in on YouTube for the whole presentation, and I'd say it was very consistent with everything that we've been told and understand about all of the federal funding sources that are at our disposal. The one thing that came up at our last meeting, the VASBO meeting, and when I believe Bill and Jill and Brad were all there, was kind of a question, a wondering, but we thought we should bring it back to you folks, and which is the fact that the legislation passed last year that was meant to help mitigate the impact on school tax rates. What it did was it held the ADM constant this year. And so as a result of that, the equalized pupil counts that we are receiving right now from the Agency of Education reflect an ADM that is at least not lower than it was the prior year. One of the interesting things about that, of course, is ADM, while it's probably the most significant variable, it's really only one of the variables that goes into the calculation of equalized pupils. And so the question came up at our meeting of whether it was the intent of the legislature to hold equalized pupils constant, which would ensure that a decrease in equalized pupils that may have been attributable to any sort of coronavirus impact would not result in an increase in tax rates. So the question is this a technical kind of situation where a technical correction could be considered if the intent was really to just hold districts harmless with respect to enrollment changes resulting from equal, or whether it, again, if it was fully the intent and this was discussed when the decision was made, then I think we'd end the conversation there and we wouldn't pursue it further. But that was the question. I think I've captured it correctly. I'd throw it back to Brad James if he wants to add. He discussed this with us as well. So Brad, did I overlook anything there?
No, I think you summed it up nicely, Nathan. That was the base of the conversation after I explained to you why as a business manager, why numbers could change in terms of equalized pupils.
I think I will defer to Senator Hardy since she was on education. My recollection, and it just kind of was one of those things that went through as we were cobbling together bills trying to protect schools last year, was exactly that. At that point, we were hearing about families and, they were going to go into homeschooling, or some people were sending their kids to private school because the private schools were staying open. And my daughter's on a school board and has children with some asthma and was thinking about homeschooling them until her superintendent pointed out that if 5 kids stayed home, that they lost the cost of a teacher. So her kids are back in school. But I think it was a response to those concerns. I think, as in all things we did last year as an emergency response, I assume most of us are open to be corrected by reality. If that's not what happened, we kicked the $58 million can down the road too last year, and we're going to have to fix that. So we've got some fixing to do and look for input. Ruth, did Ed do more work on that?
Yeah, we did. And I actually pulled up Act 137 to see if I could look at the specific language. Brad, do you have the specific language? Because we worked on this.
You're talking about the ADM issue, Ruth?
Yeah, exactly.
I'm going to paraphrase. It says that that your FY21, this current year ADM that goes into FY22 equalized pupils cannot be less than your FY20 ADM, which also goes into your FY22 equalized pupils. This is 2-year. I was not necessarily part of those conversations, so I don't know what the thinking was. I do know that people, that people were concerned about a lot of kids not coming back to school this year. Homeschooling numbers did go up. They went up from about 2,000 roughly last year to about 5,000 this year, an increase of 3,000. So it's a significant count. So the numbers are down quite a bit. So essentially what was put in place was a hold harmless for ADM, not necessarily equalized pupils, because there are other factors in there. And this is, I don't want to get into this in too much detail, but just to let you know, the other factors are where the weighting factors hit, how many kids are in each group, because that changes over time. The weighting factors also depend on your poverty counts, which have changed, and your state place student counts, which have changed, and your ELL students, which have changed. Those counts have all changed. All those factors, plus the equalization ratio itself, plus whether you were held harmless the prior year, they all factor into what Nathan was saying into your equalized pupils this year. We can talk about it. Now's not the time, but we can.
The ADM count is used as the basis for calculating equalized pupils, correct?
That's right.
Yes. So the intent was to hold schools harmless for actual pupils that may have been held home, like Senator Cummings mentioned, to hold them harmless for the students who were going to not be in the classroom. That wasn't intended, from my recollection, and I certainly can't speak for the whole education committee, let alone the entire legislature, but my recollection from our conversations was just to get at that issue of if students were being kept home by parents because they were concerned about COVID, or because they couldn't manage the hybrid schooling, or because of a whole host of reasons why parents might be worried and keep their kids home, or the logistics might be better to keep them home. We were trying to hold schools harmless for that. We didn't get into the details of which kids might be kept home, which would be sort of more addressed with the equalized pupil thing. It was the language that we adopted in the Senate, I believe, came over from the House. I don't think we changed that language specific to the ADM. And I believe the House language was what was specifically recommended by the Secretary of Education. So Secretary French is the one who, we literally took the language he recommended, is my recollection of it. So it was intended to be actual pupils, not equalized pupils, is my recollection. But I can certainly speak to look through it more in detail, and we can get back to this if you want.
There's going to be an issue. We always are open to making corrections.
If I may, I know we're short on time, and I think that's really helpful context, and that may be the end of the story. In fact, I think the question, again, that came up in the minds of business managers was the fact that holding ADM constant may make all the sense in the world for exactly the reasons that Senator Hardy just discussed. It just doesn't have, I think, the impact that some people speculated may have been the intent, which was to hold equalized pupils constant. And obviously, if you hold equalized pupils constant, you effectively remove the possibility of a change in equalized pupils as being one of the things that causes a town's tax rate to increase, right? So it could still increase even with, or decrease, frankly, go in either direction, but equalized pupils could change and have an impact on a tax rate, even with the holding constant ADM, and that's fine. So I think what I'm taking from this conversation, frankly, is there was a specific intent to address the changes in ADM that could result from COVID, not to say we want to hold equalized pupils constant. And to me, I think I can explain that to my colleagues, and that can be the end of it.
I again want to just reiterate that I don't speak for the whole legislature, though, Nathan. So this is just one senator's recollection from last year, and I'm happy to get the opinions of the former chair and my colleagues and others, and to look at the materials more, my notes and everything. That I didn't expect this question, so I wasn't as prepared. So,
and I think as the budgets get worked out, if there is an issue, let us know. Our intent was to hold schools as harmless as possible from the effects of something they didn't control. So we will be working on school funding quite a bit, as usual, and we will go forward. Any other questions at this point? Senator McDonald.
Madam Chair, someone mentioned that last fall we cobbled things together, and I would say that the Commissioner of Education was an excellent cobbler, and did well. And I think the reason we're having this discussion is because you often cobble things together when you have an emergency, and then now you take a look at what you would do differently for moving forward, and what you would alter now if you thought it was in need of being altered. I'm laying the grounds for our broadband discussion, but we're going to run into several things were cobbled together and probably try and look at them each with the same intent. So
Don't always do things the most best way in an emergency. You have different priorities. I'm going to ask Chloe, are you available at 3:30?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, I'm going to give y'all a break until 3:30. Thank everybody. I think this was, now that we've come out, get a few steps back from the initial crisis and all the funds, this was very helpful to understand and to see where we came from and where we're going, and we'll be in touch. So thank you, everyone. Faith, can you put up the in recess thing, folks?
I will.
Shut off your video and probably your audio, and then at 3:30, you can just click them back on, and we'll put we're taking a brief half-hour pause.
Thanks, AOE folks.
Yes.
You're welcome. And Ruth, I'll get you that information.
Sounds great. Thanks, Brad.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Are you there, Faith?
I am here, Senator.
What time are we supposed to be back?
3:30.
Okay. Thank you. Am I missing something? This is 3:30.
It's 3:29, Senator.
Oh, mine says 3:33 p.m.
Nope, 3:29, both my computers. Hold your
No,
horses.
This is a state iPad. So
Well, it's 3:33.
Yeah, no, my state iPad said 3:29. Still says 3:29.
As does mine.
Your iPad. Must be the genetic pull of something up there and
yeah, I got
Marshall
3:29
Islands.
on my phone. Yeah. I've
I
never.
now have 3:30. So who's here? Faith, maybe we can take down the.
I've never did. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
1, 2, 3 live, 4 live.
And
Senator
Faith.
Gray looks like he's at the ocean, but maybe it's the mountains. And I don't see the Chittenden County delegation in yet. Okay, Senator Sirotkin is in the waiting room. Okay. So I think we have everyone but Senator Pearson. So I'm going to put us back on. We are now live. I guess we always have been live. They've just been looking at a blank screen. So we're going now to Chloe, and there's Chloe.
Hi.
You're going to walk us through the Ed Fund. Oh, that's a cat. Now we got a cow with a cat's head. Or actually, it's a cat's rear end, but strange things are happening at McDonald's house. Okay, so here we go.
Okay, so here we go. Chloe Wexler from the Legislative Joint Fiscal Office. I'm here to give a brief introduction to the education finance system in Vermont. This is a presentation you may have seen before, a version of it given by Mark Peralt, who's the education analyst at our office. While he is unavailable, Catherine and I are here to walk you through this. And feel free to sort of pause me and ask questions as we go through this, so that to make sure that everyone understands. So I'm going to be sort of controlling this, and it's moving slowly, but
Starting to move.
I had to connect to, okay. Okay, so here we go. So basically just an overview. In this presentation, we're going to go over a couple of, like I said, components of education finance in Vermont. We're going to review the sort of general timeline for setting property tax rates and funding schools. Whoa, just jumped back around. Sorry about this. Okay, the education fund outlook and the revenues that are available to support education expenditures. Sort of the key education terminology, the language that we use to discuss this, how homestead property taxes are calculated, and a brief introduction to the property tax credit. So the first thing is, is the education finance timeline. So we're right at the beginning. The tax commissioner has just released, about a month ago, released the December 1st letter, which is a consensus estimate on sort of projections for the education fund and property tax rates for the next fiscal year. This is supposed to sort of be a tool for school boards to start to get an idea of the status of the education fund and how that will affect their budgets. Okay, this is really not working that great.
Is this something that Faith has that she could?
Yeah, it is something that Faith has. I don't know.
Can we take this down? Have you put it up? Would that work better? Or?
We could try that.
Senator Cummings, I'll give it a try. If my internet goes out, though, my screen share.
Yeah, you've got, and I've had touchy internet today. When are we talking to the broadband people?
It's on the website too. If people are able to pull it up on their own computers.
Okay.
I will. I need to go get it, and I'll be there in a moment.
Thanks, Faith. Sorry about that. I think it has to do with the fact that I'm trying to share it over the internet, also, like double shared over the internet, maybe. But I can keep sort of for this particular slide. We probably don't need the slide, so I can keep talking through it as long as I can find it on my end. Oh, there it is. Amazing.
Okay.
Okay, here we go. So next slide, Faith. Okay. Okay, so up one. Still on the education finance timeline.
You want to go back?
Yes. Okay.
There you go.
All right, take 3, kind of. So as I said, we were at the December 1 letter. That's sort of where we are right now in the timeline, with the caveat that we will be receiving a new revenue forecast in January, and that will, and we will use that to sort of update the December 1 projections and see where we are with those sort of non-property tax revenues and how that affects the fund. School boards develop budgets and submit them to their voters for approval in March at town meeting, either at the meeting or, this year, very likely they're all going to do Australian ballots. Based on those locally voted budgets, the legislature sets the yields and sort of therefore the base education tax rates at the level necessary to fund those voter approved budgets. The tax department then sets.
Someone needs to mute.
The tax department sets spending adjusted homestead tax rates for each town on or before June 30th. And then so actually local municipalities will then actually send out those tax bills to property owners on local schedules. Typically, taxpayers will receive their first will pay their first bill in the fall. And then the school districts will receive payments from the education fund to support their approved budgeted operations. So that's just a broad overview. And then if we move on to the next slide, we'll talk
Madam
about.
Chair, can I ask a quick timeline question?
Yes. Senator Bray.
Chloe, can you, between the town meeting week vote that usually includes the school budgets and the bills going out on June 30th, do you know, and the setting of the rate, how busy that time period is? And the reason I ask is because there are some towns talking about delaying town meetings. I don't know if they're also planning on delaying their school votes till the month of May, for instance, and the hope that they could, if the weather were cooperative, allow them to meet in person and outside and that kind of thing. So I don't know if a May meeting jams up the works for doing the other steps.
That's I hadn't heard that. And that's definitely interesting. I guess it depends how many, towns choose to do that. And if school boards sort of choose to do the same. Because, and it's actually every year it is sort of an estimate when we update the yields. Usually at town meeting, we do that based on what we're hearing, it all comes from Brad James, who you just heard earlier today. He is in touch with schools and school boards and business managers, and they will provide him with sort of their estimated budget prior to town meeting, and then we can sort of like reevaluate the yields and the status of the fund. And then we usually do that again prior to adjournment anyways. We try and get the most up-to-date numbers that we can. So I don't think it would be a huge issue. It just means that we wouldn't be able, the legislature, you could move on a yield prior to receiving all of those budgets. It would just be more of an estimate than it is in previous years.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
And we have to make it up either with the surplus or a deficit the next year, right?
Yeah, to the event, there would be sort of an estimation element in that.
Madam Chair?
Yes, Senator Sorokin.
So I'm going to demonstrate my ignorance here after all these years, but would it be helpful? Well, it'd be helpful to me, I think, if on this timeline you could take an example of several towns, like a town from each of our districts, maybe do, 4 or 5, and just use some numbers to show how these points in time influence the decision making. Like, how does the letter in any way affect the school board in developing their budget? And then how do those, but using a specific town to show how they come up with their final tax rate. Does that make
sure.
any sense?
Yeah, no, it absolutely makes sense. And I actually think that what might be interesting is to have, a school board member come in and sort of speak to that. And I know that there are a couple school board members in the legislature. So maybe that would be really helpful, because it definitely, the state timeline and the school board timeline don't sort of like directly align. because schools are typically start developing their budgets in the fall, and then have a pretty good idea of what their budget's going to be by the time the December 1st letter comes out. And then I think they're mainly using the December 1 letter as sort of like a fine tuning tool. But a lot of, a lot of the costs are relatively fixed year over year for schools. So there's not a huge amount of variability for them, I think. But I'm happy to, sort of look into that a little bit more or have a discussion with you offline on that.
I'd be happy to do it offline and to use, for instance, my town of South Burlington, where I live, just to understand what their reaction is to this letter and how it might affect their budget and what they then project as their tax rate for their town, because every town is different.
Sure. Sure, absolutely. And, we can also talk to Nathan Lavery, who was just in here as well.
Okay, thank you.
So, yeah, absolutely. So
again, the schools don't necessarily project their tax rate because of Act 60. Your school can actually come in with a reduced tax rate and still have a tax increase if a whole bunch of other schools go up. It all goes through the redistribution formula. So it's not as simple as A leads to B leads to C, and then there's a whirlpool.
Madam Chair?
And the magic answer comes out. And that's always been our problem with Act 60. It does it, but how it does it is more complicated than that.
Madam Chair?
Yes.
If
Senator McDonald does have drawings, though.
with your permission, when Act 60 first passed, the Education Department and the governor's office had a pretty good estimate on how much the statewide property tax would raise. And that number was fixed in statute. And what happened the 3 or 4 years of the first 3 or 4 years of Act 60, that the governor's office, different governors, determined how much money was necessary for the schools based on what the estimate was on what they were going to spend. And then they realized that the tax rate was going to bring in a heck of a lot more money than was needed. And the administrations budgeted that extra money to reduce the general fund contribution.
That's when it was
So-
set at $1.10, Senator?
Yes.
Okay.
And
Statewide
in order-
property tax.
in order for the legislature, what would happen is the legislature would show up and the education money, find that the education money that had been called for in the law was being used to reduce the general fund expenditure and was supporting state government, which was a problem when most people who voted against Act 60 said they were afraid that we would use the statewide property tax to support the state government's general fund. And that was put in there so that we could stop that practice. And since we've gone to a yield, it has become less, it hasn't been quite as important a number, but and finally the legislature in the spring does not adjust the tax rate to fund the state school system based on what local voters have decided. We do what we think's best, and sometimes that is actually funding what the voters have decided, and sometimes it's not, and that's usually a political hassle that we go through every year, and that's our job. But so I will stop there, but it's one thing to understand the mechanisms that we have before us. It's another to have them explain to us what their intents are.
Okay. So we've now muddied up that water, but
Or
clarified it.
Madam Chair, can I jump in just a second to say to Senator Saratkin and Ms. Wexler that when you do your little tutorial session, I would love to jump into it too, because although I've worked on these numbers at different times, it's a little fuzzy for me now, and I want to have it come into sharp focus before we get to the other end of this session.
Okay. So I'll leave it to you guys to find some time to zoom down with Chloe and, you know, work through how this system works, at least as clearly as it's possible to do.
Sure. And I think that maybe Senator Hardy might actually be on the school board. So, or was, so maybe she'll join us as well.
Okay.
I'm happy to help with the presentation. I can tell you how it works on the ground.
I think that would be helpful. Okay. So we're at the Education Fund Outlook, right?
Yes, we're at the Education Fund Outlook. So the tool that the legislature uses to sort of have these policy discussions and discussions around setting the yields and the status of the fund is the Education Fund Outlook. So this allows legislators to sort of determine the amount of revenues that must be raised through education taxes each year, to set, like I just said, to set the yields and the base education rates, and also potentially, you know, depending on legislative interest, to evaluate education finance policy changes. So the next following slides sort of provide a broad overview of the information that's included in the Education Fund Outlook. These include, you know, what are the sources of education fund revenue and how are these revenues used? So just saying, all of the numbers in the following slides represent FY 2019 funding. And sort of one last thing that I want to note on the Education Fund Outlook is that it is not a sort of a accounting fund statement. It shows appropriations and not actual expenditures. So every year, you know, we sort of have a possibility that there could be a reversion line on the sheet, which sort of indicates, you know, how different the appropriations were from what was actually spent. Next slide. So here's just like sort of to, you know, I'm sure some of you have seen it before, but just to refresh everyone's memory, this is just a little picture of what we're talking about when we talk about the Education Fund Outlook. We'll be going over this in more detail at various points throughout the session, but just here is your old friend, the Education Fund Outlook. And on the next slide, we're going to talk about the sources that make up the fund. So next slide. The Education Fund, so broadly speaking, 2/3 of the total revenue sources in the Education Fund do come from the property tax. And 1/3 comes from non-property tax sources. The 2/3 that come from property tax sources, 41% comes from non-homestead properties and 26% comes from homestead properties. Next slide. Of the non-property tax sources.
It's not from the, excuse me, Madam Chair.
Yes, I hear you
The money
muttering.
doesn't come from the properties. It comes from of homestead properties. It comes from the properties or the incomes of the people that live there.
Okay,
not from the properties.
I think she's breaking that out next.
Okay.
All right.
Yes, we're going to get to that. I was trying to, you know, sort of chunk it up in pieces.
Okay.
So starting actually with the non-property tax revenues. So that is, we get 100% of the sales and use tax, 25% of the meals and rooms tax, 1/3 of the purchase and use tax, the lottery transfer, and actually there's a Medicaid transfer, and then there's also some small wind and solar property taxes. And so these are sort of the, in lieu of the general fund transfer that once, you know, funded the education fund, we now have these dedicated revenue sources. And that was actually done in FY 2019. So now, sort of, with all of that in mind, how do we spend all of this money? And this slide is really to show that nearly all of the money in the education fund goes to directly support schools, either in the form of the education payment or through state categorical aid programs. Next slide. So that was sort of the first part of the discussion for today. The next part is I wanted to provide a sort of brief overview on exactly like what Senator McDonald just brought up, sort of the three possible tax bases that are subject to the statewide education tax, and how the statewide education taxes and the homestead tax rate calculation sort of works. And we'll give a couple of examples on that. So in Vermont, there are three tax bases that are subject to the statewide education tax. There's the non-homestead property, which is basically all property that is not a homestead. So commercial, industrial, rental housing, second homes. I can't think of anything else, but I'm sure there are a couple other things. And the non-homestead property tax rate is uniform across the state. There's one statewide non-homestead property tax rate. The homestead, on the other hand, you do declare that this is your homestead for the year, that you've lived there for more than half of the year. And the homestead includes the home and all contiguous land. The homestead property tax rate in each town does vary directly in proportion to the locally voted per pupil education spending. There is a definition within homestead property, and that is a house site. And this is a subset of the homestead parcel. The house site includes no more than 2 acres of contiguous land. And it is this house site that is linked to the property tax credit, which we'll discuss more later on in these slides. Additionally, also linked to the property tax credit is the tax base that is related to household income, which is broadly defined to include all income of everybody who resided in the household at any time during the taxed year. So that could include a child that is working or even unrelated individuals. The tax rate based on your household income also varies directly in proportion to per pupil education spending. Any questions here? Okay.
You'll have to holler.
Yes, I have one question.
Sure.
Is it possible that the tax rate for homestead could be higher than for non-homestead property?
It is.
Why would we ever do that?
It depends on what that local sort of municipality has elected to spend on their students. If they have chosen to spend a really high amount per pupil, then it is possible that that tax liability could be greater than the statewide rate.
Senator Sirotkin, when we originally did those rates, it was significantly higher, and Senator McDonald probably remembers how much higher. But we knew that over time, it wasn't just possible that they would cross. And in some towns, they have crossed some time ago. At that time, we said, well, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it, and we'll have to readjust the rates. But we might want to look into that. I haven't seen any numbers for how prevalent it is where the non-homestead rate is now lower than the homestead rate. But we knew when we did it, it was a likely outcome over time.
The average homestead rate is still significantly lower than the non-homestead rate. But of course that is an average. And if you look back to the percentages that we discussed earlier in the broad makeup of the fund, the non-homestead property tax does contribute about 41% to the fund, whereas the homestead tax rate only contributes about 26%. So it really, we can go back and we can look in FY21 and see in how many instances the homestead tax rate was higher than the non-residential, but it's definitely not the average occurrence.
Okay. Senator Pearson, did I
Yeah.
hear or see you? Yep.
Yeah, Chloe, just to this point, I think Senator Sorokin's asked an important point, and Senator Cummings is right. We have to understand the prevalence. Last time I looked, this was a couple years ago, that was true in 114 towns, that the non-residential rate was lower than the residential rate. So it's not a trivial thing, and I would welcome us taking a look at that.
Sure.
Moving forward. But if you had any more up to date, or maybe could get me the table, I'm happy to do the count. But it was 114 towns. I mean, that's just about half.
I'll take a
I
look.
know at least one here. It's been, I'd say, over 10 years. So maybe we want to have a discussion about that. And, as we look at the numbers and look at the impact of if we change things.
Madam Chair.
And the reasons why they're changing. Senator Sorokin, did I hear you? I heard someone.
I think it's Senator Bray.
Okay.
And another non-trivial group is renters, right? There's something like 1 out of 3 Vermonters rent. So how do they, I know we do renter rebates, but how do they plug into this system?
Senator Bray, we redid the entire renter rebate system last year.
Okay.
And we'll get you a tutorial or a copy of it. When COVID hit, the tax department asked to delay implementation for a year because they were somewhat overwhelmed with doing all the mostly business, but some of the personal rebates. But it now is more of a rent subsidy, and we can get you the whatever information you want on that. But it's really separate. It's from the entire property tax system at this point.
All right, thanks. I'll do that offline then. Thank you.
Yeah, and I can make a note to send you some information.
Thank you.
Okay, so next slide. Maybe, if Faith is still there. Yes, thank you. Okay, so, the $1 million question, how are homestead tax rates adjusted to account for per pupil spending? And so by statute, the base homestead tax rates are $1 for homestead property and $2 for household income. After voters approve their school budgets, those
2%.
2%. What did I say?
$2. 2%.
$2.
And we were all hyperventilating.
Sorry about that.
No, you're doing good.
So after voters approve their school budgets, these base tax rates are adjusted by the locally voted per pupil education spending. And that is done through the use of the property yield and the income yield. And so these are all sort of terms of art in Vermont education finance, the property and income yield, education spending, and equalized pupils. So we're going to talk about those and go through this calculation a little bit more on the next couple of slides. So the first thing is, and this is people always ask, what is education spending? Because, voters, when you go to, vote on town meeting day, you will approve a school budget. And education spending is actually a subset of that budget. It's really your overall school budget minus the two main things are federal aid and state categorical aid. And then any other sort of expected revenues that the district might have, such as tuition payments or, the school lunch program or something. But education spending is really the number that we're primarily talking about. Next slide. The next thing that we talk about is, education spending per equalized pupil. So what's an equalized pupil? The objective of calculating an equalized pupil is to create sort of an average student in terms of assumed costs. For example, different categories of students are more expensive or less expensive to educate. It's more expensive to educate a 10th grader than it is a kindergartner because you have labs and textbooks and, lots of different things. So the cost categories that we differentiate for currently are grade of study, economically disadvantaged students, and English language learners. The calculation for equalized pupils is done by the Agency of Education, and it's based on actually 2 years of average daily membership data. This is sort of getting back to that discussion you guys just had with Nathan Lavery. ADM is the number of full-time equivalent resident students whose education is paid for by the district from the 11th to the 30th day of the school year. So this usually happens in October. And then the agency calculates the number of equalized pupils in each district, and that information is sort of relayed back to school districts and factors into their there's education spending for equalized pupil. Next slide. So I wanted to give you a little bit of a real world example. You might be familiar with seeing something like this when you vote on town meeting. This would be the article that would appear on your ballot or in your town meeting. So shall the voters of the school district adopt a budget of 25 million, rounding, which is the amount the school board has determined necessary to fund the following fiscal year. And then there will be a sentence that indicates what education spending per pupil that sort of calculates out to. And then there will often be a indication of how much or less higher that is than the previous year. And sort of breaking out what this really means and what information we can get from this. So sort of stepping back, like we said, the budget is really everything that the school is planning on spending. We then subtract in this example, about $4 million for categorical grants and federal money, which brings us to our education spending of about 21 million in this case. This imaginary district had 1,255 equalized pupils, which brings us to that education spending per equalized pupil figure of about 16,900 in this example. So I just thought this would be nice to sort of demystify what you see on your ballot. So any questions here?
Yeah, quick one. Federal
Sure.
offset includes what sort of thing?
Schools will get, federal money for special education, and that's really the big one that I can think of. But there and also some school meals, free and reduced lunch programs. There's usually federal money for, so that would include any state or federal money that is flowing directly to that district.
Thank you.
No problem.
So I have a question.
Sure.
Just so I'm sure I'm on the right track here. Equalized pupils, I had to step out of the room. I know it was on the last slide, but the equalized pupils, if you have a a lot of non-English speaking students in a district, is that going to result in your equalized pupils going up above the actual number of pupils?
Yes.
Okay, and is this the standard language of an article, and is that governed by statute?
I think that there is a statute that does govern the language to some extent. I would have to double check on that for you, but I did pull this from an actual ballot. So I changed the numbers a little bit, but I will reach out to maybe Abby and ask her about that.
And I know we have in the past, probably the other body more than us, have played around with the wording requiring that certain things be exposed.
Yeah.
You know, that working on the assumption that people really didn't understand what they were doing and would vote down their budgets if they did. I don't think that's ever worked, but I know over time things have been required to be somewhere, either on your tax bill and I'm pretty sure on the warning.
Yes, this is the language that's required by statute to be on the warning. I think Chloe got it. It's actually specifically in statute. Oh, Brad, I interrupted you, but
no, I was interrupting you.
It requires this language. I don't think it requires the bottom part where it says budget equals that. This.
Oh, no,
part.
That was just for you guys. I put that in.
The language up above is what voters, all of us, would see. I think that change was made 4 years ago. It sounds before I was in the legislature, but while I was on a school board, I remember that change happening.
Well, I guess I know better than to jump to a conclusion without knowing all the facts, but I would venture to say that a lot of voters don't understand what the term equalized pupil means when they're voting.
You're probably right. It's a complicated construct.
And I know in one of the things I'm pretty sure we've added in the past is the average state spending per pupil is. So you'd know if, you know, the average is 9,000 and you're spending 16, in theory, you'd ask, how come? So, you know, this has been changed probably as much as we've changed the tax bill over the last few years. I'm not sure any of it has yielded any change in the voting habits, but we keep trying.
Right. It seems like it's part transparency and part shaming.
Yes, it's exactly what it is.
Okay, well, we can't fix it today. So next slide.
You're not responsible for our bad deeds.
But so basically now, you know, once they have voted to agree to, you know, the level of education spending per pupil, we can then sort of, it then enables them to be able to calculate their homestead education and income tax liability through the yield. And so the yield can really be thought of as the amount of per pupil spending that can be supported by a tax rate of $1 or on 2% of household income. So in this example, in FY 2019, the property yield was $10,220 per pupil, and the income yield was $12,380 per pupil. In this example district, they voted to spend $16,925 per pupil. And so therefore their homestead tax rate is proportionally higher than what they could have spent for $1. So in this example, it would be 1.656, and the income yield would be 2.73%. Any-
Just Madam Chair,
Yes,
Madam Chair.
Senator McDonald.
when looking at this chart, every time the word pupil per pupil and the word pupil is written, it means equalized pupil.
Yes.
Okay, so
Yes,
maybe
I should add that in.
when you don't write that, it suggests to some people that that's different from equalized pupil. Okay, thank you. Thank you.
No, thank you for the clarification. So any other questions here or? Okay, so next slide. This is everybody's favorite slide. So now that we've determined your homestead education tax rate, there is one other adjustment that we apply, and that is the common level of appraisal. And so this is something that tends to be a little bit confusing for people, but because we have a statewide education system, we have to make sure that everybody's properties are sort of reflective of the same time in, the same market value, if you will. And we do have local control over those grand lists. And so every town will have a different appraisal cycle. So the town that I live in could have appraised last year, and the town next door could have appraised 10 years ago. So those property values are very different. And so each year, the tax department and the Department of Property Valuation and Review performs an equalization study that analyzes the sales in all of the towns across the state and sort of determines the difference between the current value of property, the current appraised value of property in that town, and how much the properties are actually selling for on the market. And that adjustment is the common level of appraisal. So in our example, the school district that we're talking about with the tax rate of 1.65 also has a common level of appraisal of 89%, which means that they likely haven't done a reappraisal in a while, and their property values are growing. So the appraised value of the property only is equal to 89% of what homes are actually selling for. And so therefore, to make sure that everybody in the state is contributing proportionally, their tax rate would be 1.86. So a lot to take in. So yes, are there any questions?
Yes, please.
Yes.
What is the timing on setting that value? Because I'm just thinking, for instance, we've had a boom real estate market. So it would seem like a lot of towns would theoretically be undervalued at the moment, but I don't know when that snapshot gets taken compared to what's been going on in the market.
Absolutely. That's a good question. So it is, the snapshot for Grand List is of April 1st. And the equalization study actually takes into account 3 years of sales data. So the common level appraisals that we're going to be looking at for FY22 are based on 3 years of sales data, actually from April 1st, 2017 to March 31st, 2020. So it actually, this year, it will not include the majority of what we can call the pandemic related sales. That will affect CLAs for FY23. But we do have that 3 years to sort of try and smooth out trends in the market.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
Can I just jump in quickly, Madam Chair? It's Brad.
Oh, yes, please.
I just wanted to say, because I interpret your question a little bit differently, Senator Bray. When the common level appraisal drops below 80%, they are required to get a reappraisal. It oftentimes takes several years to get it, but they're required to. And when the coefficient of dispersion goes above 20, they are also required. Those are both measures of how values are structured throughout the town.
Uh-huh.
So
Okay.
would define coefficient of dispersion for us, please.
Not fair.
It's a little bit like a standard deviation, which probably doesn't help. It's looking at how far values are either plus or minus from a median point is basically what it is. That, and it's a measure of that.
Right.
The
So
larger
if-
the number is above
yeah.
zero, the more the dispersed, the more it's
Okay.
unequal.
What
So
would cause
can I-
it? What would cause the coefficient of dispersion to get large or to be wide?
I don't want to jump into there. I would suggest you. I mean, I could give you some explanation, but it's probably not going to be the best one. I would suggest that you ask that question of property valuation and review, because I don't want to get it
Okay,
wrong. And have
okay.
people think the-
Okay.
Can I ask my lay version of that question, which is just that if you have a small subset of houses that sold, for instance, in a boom, like just recently, they may be quite out of line with the values of all the others. Is that what the dispersion notion is, that now you have sort of an erratic list that needs to be narrowed back up again?
Yeah, I
Sort of.
think that could be one cause. Yes.
Okay.
I think we will have property valuation come in and do a presentation on common level of appraisal. Suffice it to say that there's all kinds of dispersions that can go on between new houses and old houses are the big ones. If you don't, you don't reappraise and you're still going at what the house sold for 50 years ago. I wish my house were appraised there. New people pay a bigger amount. We put the 3-year, I've always called it a rolling average in, so that when housing prices start to escalate, as they may be now in some towns, the town doesn't suddenly find, its appraisal all out of whack and people find their property values are going up and their tax bills are going up. And we put it in mostly when values started to go down, because when values go down, you have to raise the tax rate to raise the same amount of money. And so, but it also keeps us from feeling the full impact of when values go up and making more money. So we'll have them all in. We'll get a whole tutorial on common level of appraisal and appraisals in general.
Every year, the Department of Property Valuation and Review releases an annual report. And I believe that's actually scheduled to come out in mid-January. So it would be good to have them come in and talk about that as well.
Yeah. And it's gotten a lot more professional in the years since we started this. The Board of Appraisers in most towns were elected at town meeting and didn't necessarily know anything about property values, except maybe common sense. And there's now training required, training provided. We've become a much more professional system than we were probably 20 years ago when this all started. But it still can be challenging.
There's also a process where towns and school districts can ask for it to be reviewed if they don't believe that their CLA is correct. And I was involved in 2 reviews from towns, because our small towns may only have had a few houses sell over the last 3 years because they're so tiny. And so that can really skew it. And or there could be some weird thing like a pandemic that would really affect the property values. So they can be reviewed if a town or a school district feels like they're off, and then they can be adjusted based on that review.
Okay. So Chloe, let's go back to taxes.
Well, we're almost there.
I know.
So the last thing that I want to just touch on briefly is the property tax credit. And so this touches on, back to about 10 slides ago when Senator McDonald brought up the fact that the homestead portion could be based on homestead property values or household income. And how we achieve that is through the property tax credit. So property owning residents of Vermont are eligible for assistance to pay property taxes based on their household income. So what the tax department does every year is they compare the amount of property tax that you paid on your house site. Recall that's a subset of the homestead, so that home and 2 acres, versus what you would have been eligible to pay based on your household income times the income percentage. If the income, the amount you were eligible to pay based on income is less than that of your property liability, you will receive that difference in the form of a credit on your tax bill in the following year. That's where it can sometimes get a little bit confusing because there is that 1 year sort of disconnect, but it really, the reason for the disconnect is really due to the timing of when you file your income taxes, because we need to know what your income was in the year that you paid your taxes, and we don't have that information until April when you file. And then just flagging that income rate is also adjusted based on local education spending in the same manner as the homestead education property tax. So just the next slide is going to sort of show sort of how much the property tax credit adjusts gross homestead education tax rates every year. So in FY19, the gross homestead education property tax was about $595 million. We provided $166 million in credits. So those were credits that were actually from people's FY18 liabilities, leaving us with what we call a net homestead property tax of $430 million. And that is the amount that makes up that 26% of the fund.
Okay, so Chloe, we raised 595,000, right?
595 million.
Million. Okay.
Yeah.
And then we rebated 166 million.
Yes, exactly.
So, okay. And we also did current use out of the property tax, correct?
Yes, but you don't see that as a direct rebate. That acts more like a tax expenditure.
Right.
And that would be also something probably good to have PV&R talk about.
Madam Chair?
Yes.
Madam Chair.
Yes.
But
Senator
while
McDonald.
we're on this slide, it helps us to, this particular slide helps us to understand why some people and some Vermonters say that we have the highest statewide taxes in compared to the rest of the states. And that's one of the reasons is that our bookkeeping method goes out and taxes people on that green amount. And that is counted as high taxes compared to other states. And then the gray amount on the second bar is rebated to the same people. And that's counted as spending. So you can make the argument that Vermont is a high taxed state because it has that big green amount, and that we spend a lot of money because we rebate that gray amount. And were we to change our bookkeeping and simply tax the citizens the orange amount, instead of taxing them one and then spending to rebate, statistically, compared to the rest of the states, we would suddenly, without any change in actual household effect, have a lower state tax rate compared to other states.
Why haven't we done that?
Well, Janet Ansel
We'll have to have a talk.
and the House Ways and Means has proposed that on a couple occasions, and it's been awful complicated and difficult, and we just haven't tackled it. And yeah, but that's the $166 million is money that people don't owe, and yet they've according to the Green Line, they've paid money. They've paid that amount of money, and I'm just repeating myself. We appropriate that 166 million, and it gets tagged on to Vermont's big spenders. So,
if I may, Madam Chair,
Yes,
the door-to-door campaigning version of that is someone says how high their tax bill is, and then you say, but what do you actually pay? And then they tell you, and then they go, but still, my tax bill is, whatever, the green bar. And somehow there's a disconnect where people seem to feel the bigger number, even if they pay the orange number.
You know what my theory is? Most of us pay a lot more in income tax than property tax, but it's taken out or it's paid on a monthly incremental basis. The property tax is paid in 1, 2, 3 lump sums, and they're big lump sums, and therefore it's a lot harder to pay $2,000 than it is, one lump sum than to have $20 or $10 a week taken out of your paycheck.
Some people pay their property taxes with the old Christmas club.
Well, if you get a mortgage, you're required to pay it in escrow.
No, you're not. Some people are, some are not.
I haven't seen a mortgage in a long time unless you've got really good financing, down payment, where that isn't a requirement, along with insurance.
I don't have an escrow in my mortgage, so.
Madam Chair?
Okay. It
Common
depends
practice, but not required.
Well, try getting a new mortgage.
I have.
So anyway, it's a percent you put down, but it's paid on a monthly basis, and then the bank pays quarterly or every 6 months, or some towns it's once a year.
You're correct, Madam Chair, that those people who have an escrow account as part of their mortgage are not getting hit once a year. They're getting hit monthly. You're correct.
But it's just more painful to pay one big lump sum than it is to
same amount of money.
Yep, same amount of money.
Madam Chair?
Yes, Senator Sorokin.
Very narrow, but I'm really curious. For people who do qualify for the credit and have more than 2 acres, how does the assessment done? I mean, I've never seen assessments that are done other than on the complete property. So how do the taxing authorities break out the extra land to apply the homestead rate to that versus, or vice versa? How do you take out a house site and 2 acres to determine what the credit is?
Ask property evaluation and review. They would do the best job on that.
I think we've got a full day next week taken up with property valuation.
Okay, thank you.
Okay,
They'll
Chloe.
be so excited. We only
Sure.
have a couple more slides.
Okay.
But Faith, can you bring us back there, maybe? So included in this property tax credit, I just a quick reminder of the homeowner rebate program. So there is a subset of filers, and they are included in this $166 million, at least on their education liability, that So resident homeowners with a household income of under $47,000. And so that's everybody in the house under $47,000. They're entitled to additional property tax relief based on a fixed percentage of their household income. So if your total household income is $20,000, you will pay a maximum of 1.5% of that that household income on your education tax, and a maximum of 3% on your municipal tax. And this is something that has sort of been a stalwart of education funding and property tax finance since I think pre-Act 60.
Oh, yeah. And I tried to change that last year and found out you can't. I had a constituent who was elderly. One of them was disabled, reached the age where you were required to draw money out of your IRA. They drew out the requisite $2,000 and lost $5,000 in tax benefits. And these are, were fairly young people, had a long way to go on their pension. And this one turned out to be basically impossible to change because it also affects municipal liability. And it's been around here since I've been around in government, and that's over 30 years. So it's been around for quite a while, but it is a hard cliff, and it is for people who are fairly low income. At $90,000, we ramp you down, but not on this one.
And this is the one we call, right, the circuit breaker?
Super circuit breaker.
Super circuit breaker. Thank you.
Yeah, it has some different names, but I did just want to just a brief reminder about this program. And then I think we're actually on to our last slide. You guys made it. So this is just a summary slide, sort of highlighting, what some of the key takeaways, or there's many key takeaways, but a few of the takeaways. So Vermont, obviously, as we've seen, has a unique education finance system. It's really a statewide funding formula that's coupled with local administration, which is why there is this level of complexity. School boards set budgets and submit them to their voters for approval. And then the legislature and the state sort of sets the yields annually at the level necessary to fund those voter approved budgets. Our system, since we do have this unique interplay between property and income, our system can be viewed either as an income tax system or as a property tax system with an adjustment for income. But regardless of whether you pay on property value or income, homestead tax rates do vary with locally voted spending, and the non-homestead rate does not. It is uniform statewide. And then I'm happy to answer any other questions that you might have.
You left out one step.
Uh-oh.
Then everybody yells at the legislature because the tax rate is too high.
Maybe I'll have to add that next year.
It is a constant source of frustration.
Madam Chair?
Yes.
Just on the last chart, number 3.
Sure.
The legislature sets the yield and base education property taxes annually. That they do that, period. And at a level necessary to fund voter approved school budgets that needs to be rephrased. The legislature does it, sets the level that it wants. Sometimes the tax rate goes up, sometimes it goes down. That's not an automatic thing. It's they set the rate that they agree on, and that the governor signs. Should be a period after annually.
Yeah, you're right. There is a legislative decision. Ideally, it's at the level to fund the voters approved budgets, but it is true. It can sometimes, that's why there is the stabilization reserve, and there can sometimes be legislative decisions that are made on how high or low those rates are set.
So perhaps that sentence could say ideally, or whatever you want to say.
Right.
But it's misleading.
Yes.
It's not.
There maybe
in
an ideal world.
This is Ms. Wexler. This is not on you, but it's on us. So don't attribute more or less to us. Yeah, thank you.
It's a good teaching tool, but there are always nuances the deeper you get into it.
Right. So can I just double check to make sure I'm following Senator McDonald's point here? So you could set the rate low enough, a little lower than enough to raise all the money, but then you could transfer to fill the gap. And so that's the discretion that the legislature has. So it's not lockstep. Is that the point?
We governors in the legislature have often argued about this. And there's an argument over how much would be appropriated to fund education. And we sort of got away from that argument when we went to the sales tax and eliminated the general fund transfer. And it's only been a couple of years since that happened. And we, the legislature, now roll all our dice on how much the sales tax brings in. And if the sales tax doesn't bring it in, and the tax rate goes up, we get blamed for not funding it. If the sales tax shows big numbers, all of a sudden the local spending is covered and we look like angels. We have signed on to, with the change in 2019, to a much riskier source of money that we use to spend to operate our schools. We used to have a general fund transfer, which was every year was required and was announced on the 1st of December, how much it would deliver, that was based on cost of living, that was based on, plus so much per pupil, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we got rid of that when the Appropriations Committee said, this is killing us. This is killing us, the Appropriations Committee. We've got to come up for this money every year. We'll just put it on the sales tax and, we'll slap our hands and it won't be our problem anymore. So that's, we're in a more volatile situation than we were a couple of years ago.
We are. The sales tax, before we did this, is relatively as stable as the income tax. And we looked at the charts. The issue came during the last great recession, in which there was a required amount that was transferred from the general fund to the ed fund. It was inflation. It was a formula.
Yep.
However, in order to do that, we had to take the money from other good things like safety net programs. And that was, okay. So if you're only interested in the ed fund, that's fine. Some of us care about the safety net. So we keep trying to find that balance.
Madam Chair, you are correct.
And school budgets kept getting voted up significantly, even though everybody, we were laying off state employees, people were, all other segments of the economy were tightening their belt. And it was felt that education wasn't being asked to share that pain. So that's right now, it's working for us.
It is what it is, and the arguments that you outlined were offered at the time, and we are where we are today.
Right. Okay, Senator Hardy.
Thank you. Thank you, Chloe. That was really a good presentation.
Thank you.
Hey, for a rookie, yes.
I'm not a rookie to School Finance Center, McDonald.
No, it's just
But
first time.
I
we've-
wanted to bring it, I wanted to actually, before Brad James leaves, wanted to mention during our break, I went through all of my notes from last session about the ADM versus equalized pupil conversation. And I found, I think, 5 occasions where I take pretty good notes during these meetings, and I found 5 occasions where we discussed it. And on every occasion, we discussed it as ADM. Never was it equalized pupils. And in fact, we had one all Senate caucus where Senator Cummings asked the Secretary of Education for clarification on this very point. And his answer was specifically ADM. So I think that at least based on my notes, it's a pretty clear indication that in every single time, our intent was to hold ADM harmless, but not to hold obviously there's a calculation. It wasn't about equalized pupils. So like I said, I can't speak for the whole legislature, but that's what my records show. And I think that that's pretty clear what our intent was. And if you're able to pass that on.
That was my understanding through the process. I just wasn't really part of this conversation, but it's most definitely my understanding. So
Yeah.
I'll talk.
Okay, and if you want me to put that in writing for whatever it's worth, I certainly can. But yeah, it was really Secretary French that was taking the lead on the conversation, but he was clear every single time, and we were clear every single time. And it was not just the Education Committee. There was the whole Senate was involved in that conversation at one point. And like I said, it came over to us from the House. So clearly that's the way we received it. And so therefore the whole legislature. So there you go.
I think that question actually came from Nathan Lavery and the school finance director. So
right, it did, but I know Brad is in touch with them all the time. So
we can make sure.
Madam Chair, this is the first time you've had a committee appointed where everybody, thanks to Senator Hardy's presence on the Education Committee, where everyone has served on this committee before and has some history with school financing. We're not all as well versed as perhaps Senator Hardy may be, but everyone's had some experience on this before.
So committee, if there are no other questions, thank you, Chloe. I think
No problem.
sometimes when you're here, it's always good to review. I got reminded of things I should remember, but don't always. It's always good because it is a complicated system, and to remember how complicated it is helpful. We could do a whole week, couple hours on the Brigham decision, which is what led to this. But we were told that a penny on the tax rate in any town has to raise the same amount of money per student. I actually drove by Stannard the other day, and that was the poster child. And because they had to have like $3 on the tax rate, and other towns had like 3 cents to raise the same amount of money. And our system, according to the last analysis, did that. What else it may do or how equitable it is, we have the tax commission study coming in, and we'll be looking at it. But we started with a Supreme Court mandate, and that was over 20 years ago. I think it was just the year I was elected. I remember going to my first caucus and saying, guess what the Supreme Court did this afternoon? And that was our first year. So, it never hurts to take a look. I think I saw Senator Brock.
I was going to comment, and you included some of that comment about the Tax Study Commission. I just received a draft of it for review, and I gather they're going to make something public within the next week or so. I think it's going to be really important for us to get briefed on that.
Yes.
You mentioned that, of course, all of us have been exposed to education funding previously, and it's sort of like each of us has had the flu previously. We're being infected by it again.
Every year.
There's got to be an easier way to raise taxes without having to use the coefficient of dispersion to explain it. And maybe the key is each one of us has to promise within the next week to go before a public body in their district and explain education funding. And it's very difficult. One thing I will do, and I will pass on to the committee, about a year ago, I asked Brad James to give me an explanation in graphic form of education funding on one side of one piece of paper. And I have to admit, he did a very, very good job of it. And I will send it all to you tonight.
Great.
Is that in 6-point type or what?
Oh, very good. And does explain it, I think, reasonably well.
Madam Chair,
Yes, Senator Sirotkin.
I just want to thank Chloe. I thought the presentation was excellent today, and I look forward to Senator Bray at my one-on-one with Chloe to get that. Maybe a year from now, I'll do what Senator Brock says and go before some public body and explain.
Some of us had the privilege of doing that when we were putting Act 60 together. And I believe it was Bob Gross who from, I don't know if he was Joint Fiscal Department of Ed, I think. And I always took him with me because he, at that point, it was known as the shark pit that that all the money went into the shark pit and came out. And there were gold towns and loser towns. Yeah, we've come a long way, but I go back to the health and welfare motto. It's more complicated than that. And it is a complicated system. So as soon as that tax report is out, I've got them on my list to have in. We'll get property valuation in to talk to us, and we can have a really quick committee tutorial and common level of appraisal and just, yeah.
Right. I think it was my freshman year in the House. I said to Speaker Symington, I said, boy, this is really complicated. It's making me wonder if it's a good system, like why is it so complicated? No one seems to be able to explain it. And she said, well, you can have a tax code that's easy to explain, or you can have a tax code that is fair and nuanced, but you probably can't have both together in one tax code. So
I believe my counterpart in the House says, when you try and make it fair, it gets complicated. So, and I guess it does. Okay. Well, thank you all. It's been a long day. Tomorrow, I think it might be a little shorter. I'm going to, we can adjust the breaks. I'm going to try and get breaks in there. If you'd rather not get a break or you'd rather get 2 10-minute breaks, let me know. And we'll do it as best we can. We're also juggling the schedules of the witnesses and their time frame. So see where it goes.
I, for one, really appreciated that break today. One, I got up and walked around the whole time, and I had some calls to return. And I could do both at the same time. So it was relaxing. Thanks.
Yeah, I've got a call coming in 10 minutes. So we'll see, but we'll see you tomorrow after the floor.